Thank you, Craig. No, that was excellent, and you've touched on a very challenging topic around competency, and actually we've got a number of questions in on that particular item. It is a difficult area to define, and obviously I think one of the key messages there is knowing your limits and making sure that we work as a team, as an industry, to get a common and sensible approach to facade and fire performance. Right, so now I've got quite a number of questions. We're just over the hour. We're fine to keep going, and so if you want to stay on and listen to the answers to the questions, then please do. So first question I have in here is from Reagan. So is there a hierarchy of preferred materials? Sorry, this is a question aimed at Anam. Is there a hierarchy of preferred materials to be used in facades on the basis of fire mitigation?
Yes, actually there is no clear hierarchy, but yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, yes.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Okay, so the first intent is to have non-combustible materials within the facade, the first thing. And if not, then non-combustible and alternate facade system, which we have as a system, it should be non-combustible, or from a material perspective, like each element of the facade system is to be non-combustible. This is the base intent of a facade system design. Where we don't achieve this, we do the test. There are a number of tests for the facade system, which is required to be followed.
Thank you, Anam. And next one is from Gary. So for Alex, are there any plans that you're aware of or committees that exist for harmonizing regulations and guidance globally? And are you seeing any consensus on a common approach internationally?
There is an international code being developed. It's in its infancy. I think there is generally a consensus over the key principles of facade designs, primarily limit the combustibility in facades. But other than that, I don't think there's too much I'm aware of. Okay, yeah, same answer for me. To be honest, I'm not aware of a specific international committee. But have you seen some common trends between the UK approach, the Australian approach, and the UAE? I think in that respect, yes. I think there's definitely the common trends are probably more in the way that engineers are practicing. More focused about going into the detail, looking at the bigger picture on projects. I think those are the common trends we see. As I say, I think the other key common trend is there's just a general reluctance to use combustibles in facades and in high buildings.
Yeah, quite understandable. Okay, on to the next question from Mohammed Hassan. This is for Craig. How do you detect major defects in on a facade installation during visual inspection? Considering obviously the facade, the existing facade is there in place, and we're unable to inspect behind it.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's the crux of the problem. You can't, you've got to have some kind of intrusive inspection. Especially when you consider, as I mentioned, the as-built information probably not being reliable, even when it does comply on paper. Often what you'll find when you start taking off panels is fire stops being missing, compartmentation that's either not been fitted or degraded over time, or whatever it may be. The crux of it is that you do need to do some kind of intrusive inspection to be 100% sure, and that's what's really jamming up the process in the UK at the moment. There's where there's an issue with value, a valuer may potentially notify the lender, for example, to say, look, we're not too sure about this cladding type. They will request what's being scoped as an external wall systems form, whereby a fire engineer or specialist has to examine the cladding. And there's only one way to do it, and you've got to take panels off. You've got to look behind the finishings, because otherwise there's no way you're going to be able to tell for sure.
Yeah, no, agreed. And I'm aware of some external heat monitoring or thermal performance monitoring approaches, but they're not comprehensive in defining the performances. So yeah, you're right. It's invasive, and then obviously it has to be appropriately selected to get the proper data. Okay, and next question I have for Anam, and this is from Bledin. Good to see you online. Anam's, in your presentation, you made a reference to both flammability and combustibility. Are those two terms clearly defined, and where would we find those definitions?
Yes, actually, yes, this is a very good question. In UK building codes for facades, which are for facades, the term combustibility is used for determining or defining the capacity of a given material to burn and how much heat it will release, and based on that, the combustibility is defined. However, flammability is a very broad term and broad concept, which also considers how different materials are combined or oriented or connected as a system. So I'll give you an example. The example to say to illustrate the difference between a combustible and a flammable facade system is if you see there are certain time you have air cavity within the facade, which is not combustible. Air cavity itself is not combustible. However, the presence of air cavity substantially alters your flammability or the reaction to flame of a fire. So it increases your flammability of the facade. So you don't have that combustible element to it, but you still affect your flammability of the facade. So these two are terms.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, back to Alex now. I have a question in from Aled. And I feel for Alad's position here. He's basically highlighting that he's working in KSA. He's having difficulties on various existing sites which have got installed facade panels which lack the accredited documentation that civil defence require. Alex, is this a common issue that we see in the region, and do you have any advice on how we can try and prevent this from happening?
I think it's a common problem in the region, and I had similar instances when I was on site for 6 months in Saudi Arabia, not really understanding or having the detailed information to know what was put in the facade system. So I think there is a real challenge, and I think there should be a real onus on providing. Going back to my presentation, actually, about having clear lines of traceability over products. I think that's really, really important, and making sure that documentation trail throughout construction is clear and concise and held within the building or within a central database.
Yeah, I completely agreed. Transparency, making sure the information is there, and unfortunately, I think that yes, there is a little bit of intentional muddying of the water, and then there's just legislation being unclear on what is required and to be provided.
I do think, in reaction to that, I do think that there are progressive steps in the industry worldwide about addressing this problem. So I have seen more recently much better documentation and traceability of all products.
You're right. It definitely seen positive steps in the region, and I think this series highlights the fact that there's still good open debate around this subject. It hasn't disappeared. This subject's been very prominent since probably the first prominent fire in UAE or Dubai of Tamwil Tower. So that's 5+ years ago now. So yeah. Okay, Craig, I've got a question in from Gary here. So you've worked in both the UAE and UK. Is it fair to say the UK is behind compared to the UAE, and has the UAE done enough?
I think it depends what we're talking about. So I would say definitely ahead in some parts. So let's look at, for example, sprinklers. It's not mandatory to have sprinklers in the UK, and indeed, there's a school of thought that looks at Grenfell and is of the opinion if sprinklers were fitted, that would not have happened. The significant fires that we mentioned in the UAE, so we've got Tamwil, the Address, Torch twice. Those didn't develop into burst fires because of the sprinklers. So there you go. There's one. UAE's on top. I think in terms of, we thought until very recently the building control process in the UK was robust. We didn't have the kind of issues that we do have, but that's transpired not to be correct. But I think both regions are probably comparable when it comes to building quality. The checks that are done in building quality. Certainly, when I worked in Dubai, we inspected a lot of high-rise buildings, and you would often find issues with compartmentation, fire stopping around services. That's one of the sort of key issues in both regions, I think, is workmanship and making sure that those critical fire engineering components are not breached. So, that's a bit of a woolly answer, but I would say, yeah, in the UAE's got some good codes now. That's not always been the case, and bear in mind there's a huge existing building stock. So, there's a lot of development to be done in both regions, I personally think.
And to add, Gary's comment had more meat to it around UK really should be leading in this aspect, and I think it's fair to respond to that, Gary, that as I said earlier, this has been an international problem. It's something that as the industry has pressed forward to improve on thermal performance, acoustic performance of a building envelope, other problems have arisen, and these have resulted in poor fire performance. So it's unfortunately it's a learning curve, and these have resulted in some significant impacts on lives and property.
That's a good point, Robin. And Grenfell was a retrofit project. That's that was the issue. It was combustible insulation that was retrofitted onto it. One of the points I just want to touch on there, Will I remember, you mentioned international moves towards the building code. I don't know if you heard the international fire safety standards. That may be what Alex was referring to before. That's just been drafted just now. So that's a coalition that the RSS has been heavily involved in. It's got partners all around the world looking at some kind of consistency in fire safety standards. So they're very basic at the moment, and that will be built upon. And that's due to be released October at the UN meeting. So that's definitely a document to keep an eye on.
Thank you. Anam, I've got a question from Jay. How does the fire industry assess new facade elements, systems, so things like PV panels, which are starting to appear as a facade element rather than an add-on to the building envelope, and what standards in the UAE are they required to comply with?
Oh, okay. PV panels are very new on the facade system. We have seen in the Expo design as well. In the Dubai Expo, they are using PV panels on the facade cladding. So there are two types of panels you can install, whether it is sometimes the panel are integrated with the facade design, or maybe other part is where the panels are installed onto the facade. In both the conditions, when we discuss with civil defense in Dubai, we have been asked to do a wall assembly test. The complete full wall assembly test to see the flame spread rates.
Okay, no, thank you. Alex, so during Craig's presentation, there was a comment that came in from Emma, very relevant comment around competency. So she stated that competency might be difficult to define, but it becomes very obvious when it's been lacking. Just leading on from that comment, so the idea of having an expert panel that would be brought together to review building inspection reports with combustible cladding, do you think this is effective? And on that panel, is it adequate just to have a fire engineer, fire service individual, and a building surveyor?
Great question. I think it's a really important one to pick up on. I really like the idea of having expert panels to look into existing buildings. And I particularly like the idea of it being a diverse panel. So it's not just narrowed down to one, maybe two people's particular views and opinions, because ultimately in the industry we're in, there are often competing views and opinions. Whether I think an expert panel should be limited to perhaps just a fire engineer, the local fire service representative and the building surveyor, no, I think it could be expanded further. I think it may be better served to have industry specialists from testing houses on board who can potentially look at similar systems they've tested and take a view on that. And potentially even sprinkler manufacturers or potential contractors to come on board. So I think having an expert panel is a great idea. but I don't think there's anything stopping it from being limited to just a few people. I think it could be expanded for real value and benefit.
Thank you. Craig, what was the government's advice on combustible cladding in the UK, and what effect did this have?
So shortly after Grenfell, there was a series of advice notes created by the UK government. They were all given numbers. There was one, advice note 11 was the one that gave advice for buildings over 18 metres with combustible cladding, and at that time it was aluminium composite material to be removed, and that had obviously a significant effect for owners in buildings over 18 metres, and that's where we started to see these problems in the home buying and selling process, where people were living in a tall building. It was found to have combustible cladding. The cost of removing that cladding was considerable. You're talking several £million for buildings 18 metres, and the higher it goes, obviously the more expensive that is. Then what happened? The government changed their advice very, very subtly. They issued a consolidated advice note, which combined all of the different advice notes into one sort of advice note. But they changed the requirement for 18 metres. So all of a sudden, buildings under 18 metres, the advice was if you've got combustible cladding, and that includes HPL, brick slips, EWI, that's found to be a problem, that should be removed. And that opened up a significant can of worms, where owners, and I saw a question coming in there about who ultimately pays for it. Unfortunately, it's the owners. They would have to pay for it, and that's part of the problem. Nobody wants to buy a property where they've got to replace the combustible cladding because of the expense. So this oversight has really jammed up the system.
I think just to probably add to that, Craig, as well, particularly on the cost aspect, you're right. No one wants to pay for it, but because of that process of no one wanting to pay for it, we often end up in a process of litigation or a blame game. And that just elongates the whole process of trying to solve the problem at its heart, which is to change a potentially high risk facade system on a building.
Yeah, that's a good point. The government they've acted since. They've created these funds. So if you are in a building, you're a manager in a building where you've got to replace the combustible cladding, there's various funds where you can apply to get money. But the process of that is long. Obviously, replacing cladding in any building is a difficult process sometimes, and it's well thought that the £1 billion, which is one of the funds for property types with other than aluminium composite material, isn't going to be enough. They reckon it's going to be maybe 4 or 5 times that. So £5 billion is the size of the problem. So it's not an easy fix. You're right.
Thank you, gentlemen. I've got a question in here from Mustafa, and it was around the retrofitting of existing buildings. So Anam, on this one, it's clearly a big challenge about the retrofitting, especially on things like high-rise. What's your understanding of the impetus to actually do that retrofit in the UAE, and are we seeing any progress in that area?
Okay. I've seen some projects where the insurance companies are actually forcing these requirements, like you have to retrofit your facade in order to get in order to reduce the premiums and all those things. We have seen some buildings in UAE where they have decided to at least go for retrofitting of the facade, change the combustible facade to a non-combustible or compliant facade. And also for doing this activity or for doing this technical assessment, we can use. There are many tools available in the market. One of the tools are on the NFPA, which is for assessing the flammability of the cladding on the high-rise building. And using that tool, we can then finally at least conclude that what are the impacts of changing the facade, and in terms of cost as well, and in terms of life safety, in terms of fire protection and everything. So after doing this assessment, that can be decided whether to do it or not.
Okay, thank you. Alex, a good question here around testing versus engineering judgments. So does everything need to be tested, or is there room in your view for a level of engineering extrapolation of existing test data?
It's a good question, and something I think which most fire engineers are opposed with over the last few years. I think it comes down to confidence, and the answer is, the simple answer is, what gives us a greater level of confidence, a tested detail or an engineered judgment? And ultimately, the most confident solution we'd ever have would be a tested detail. So if you ask me as an engineer what I would prefer to do, it would be to go down a tested detail route.
Okay, thank you. The only thing I'd add to that is coming from a engineering judgment company that I used to work for back in the UK. There is obviously some logic in the ability to test everything, and so certainly the door industry survives on field of applications where they test upper and lower limits of the door configurations and can assess in between. So I believe there's to add to Alex's point there, yes, we should test when there is insufficient evidence, and obviously if there is sufficient evidence from the prior testing that's gone on, then we can fill in the gaps. Otherwise, I would just add to that the fire stopping industry would find it particularly difficult to move forward. But yes, you're right. I can also appreciate the testing gives us a more robust outcome of how a system will function. Craig, one last question for you, Craig, on the impact of the latest fire safety bill in the UK. What is to surmise, what do you see as the impact?
The fire safety bill is the one that amends the RRO, the regulatory reform order, to make sure you have to take the cladding into account. So beforehand, people would do fire risk assessments as required by that legislation, but the cladding generally wasn't taken into account. And that was fine. Nobody had an issue with that until we realised that the extent of problem that cladding had, the fact that building regulation sign-off wasn't indicative of technical compliance. It's just the way things have transpired. So the fire safety bill will have the effect of making sure that external walls are taken into account, which, again, as I mentioned in theory, that's fine. However, when you look at this, the scope of the buildings to be included and the amount of, really competent professionals out there, there's a bit of a gap, and that's something everybody's, it's the elephant in the room that nobody's really talking about. When the fire safety bill comes out, which will probably be 2022, there's a lot of upskilling to be done before then. So that's probably the biggest effect.
Thank you. And I notice now we're half an hour over, and our numbers are starting to dwindle. So I'll wrap it up there on the questions. Any I have missed, and I'm conscious there's still a couple we can come back to after this. But yeah, I'd like to thank you all for those who've contributed in the presentations, and obviously the delegates that make these conferences worthwhile attending. So thank you very much.